Hello, friends. Mr. Pellegrino here with the read aloud for you. This is called Magic Beach by Crockett Johnson. I'm tired, said Anne. We should have stayed at the cottage and read a story. It's more fun to do something yourself instead of reading about it, said Ben. I wouldn't mind if we were in a story, said Anne, because people in stories don't go around all day looking for an old shell. Interesting things happen. Nothing really happens in a story, said Ben. Stories are just words, and words are just letters, and letters are just different kinds of marks. He began to make marks in the sand. I wish I had some bread and jam, said Anne. I'm hungry. Ben frowned. And you're hungry too, said Anne. You spelt out jam. Water from a gently breaking wave flooded at the sand, then slid back. The marks were gone, and at the edge of the wet sand, a silver dish appeared full of jam. Ben and Anne stared at it. Anne stuck her thumb in the jam and tasted it. But things like this don't happen, said Ben, except in stories. In stories about magic kingdoms, usually, said Anne. It's quite good jam. Spelled out bread. Spell out bread. Ben wrote bread in the sand. The letters faded under the next wave. Immediately, thick slices of fresh bread appeared on a golden tray. Anne spelt out milk and waited. And they had milk in crystal goblets. You're right, said Anne. It's more fun to be in a story than to read one. It depends on the ending, said Ben. Most stories have happy endings, said Anne. Can you spell beach umbrella? The sun is hot. Ben spelled tree. They ate in the shade of a young oak. Anne spelled candy for dessert. I still want a shell I can hear the sea in, said Ben. Let's ask the king. What king, said Anne. She offered the box of candy to Ben. If this is a magic kingdom, there has to be a king, said Ben. If you want a shell, you just have to spell it, said Anne. You don't have to bother anybody. But Ben had written king in the sand. A wave covered the letters. There he is, said Anne. On a rock by the sea sat a king with a fishing pole. He looked old and tired. Ben and Anne walked over to him. It's a nice day, isn't it, said Ben. The king didn't look up. Why have you come here, he said. To find a big shell, said Ben. Are there any here in our kingdom? Kingdom, said the king. Did you catch any fish, said Anne. The king shook his head. You're a king, said Ben, so this must be a kingdom. Anne's toe printed fish in the sand. A kingdom is cities and farms, said the king, and forests and castles. A fish flashed on the end of his line, and he sat up straight to bring it in. Thank you for the bread and jam and things, said Anne. We had a nice picnic under the tree, said Ben. The king turned and saw the oak at the edge of the sea. He let the fish swim free, and he put down the pole. Bent and limping, he walked slowly to the tree. He looked up questioningly at the high branches. He touched the sturdy trunk. This place was under a spell, I guess, said Anne, and we broke it. Or is it under a spell now, said the king. Under your spell. Ours, said Anne. We just spelled words, said Ben. Words with letters, said Anne, from the alphabet, like this. She spelt out forest. Of course, said the king. He watched a wave wash out the letters. Then he turned and watched the tall trees spring up from along the length of sandy beach. A royal forest, he said. He seemed to grow taller and younger. Ben spelt out farms in the sand. Anne wrote cities, and the surf came in to wipe the words away. Plowed farms appeared beyond the trees, and meadows where cows grazed. In the distance, towns and cities gleamed in the sun. It's a very pretty kingdom, said Anne. Hurry, said the king. Castles. Ben wrote castles in big letters. They were gone with the next swell of the sea. Here and there castles rose above the towns, and the kingdom was complete. The king gazed at the faraway towers of the tallest castle. I must get there in time, he said. Get where, said Ben. To his throne, of course, said Anne. To all his knights in shining armor. From beneath his robe, the king took a large seashell and he listened to it. "It's a long journey," he said, "even on a fast charger." He handed the shell to Ben. Ben put it to his ear. Anne spelled horse in the sand. "I hear the sea," said Ben. A charger stood on the edge of the spit of sand. The king went to it with long strides and hardly any limp. "Farewell," he said. "We'll ride with you," said Ben. "No," said the king. "Yes," said Anne. "We're in the story too, aren't we?" She and Ben ran along beside the horse through the woods. In a clearing, the king drew on the reins and turned to face them. His voice was stern. "You must leave the kingdom," he said. "I command it. I am the king." The charger reared and plunged into the forest toward the castle. Fading hoofbeats echoed in the trees. "Go back to the beach and ride pony twice," said Anne. "We'll follow him." Ben had the shell pressed to his ear. "The king forgot his shell," said Anne. "He meant to give it to me," said Ben. "He knew it was what I came for." He handed the shell to Anne. "Yes, I know," she said. "You can hear the sea in it." But she held the shell to her ear for a moment before she gave it back. Suddenly, she grabbed Ben's arm. "I can still hear the sea," she said. Ben stood listening. Without the shell, he heard the sea. It sounded close by. He ran between the trees toward the beach. Anne followed him. A wave broke against the tree trunks, splashing them. "The tide is coming in," said Ben. They ran in the direction of the hill, through the forest near the edge of the rising sea. "Isn't there some part of the beach left," said Anne, "where we can spell something?" "Keep running," said Ben. The water rose higher over the floor of the forest with each breaking wave. Through the trees they saw the high hill of sand. They panted, wading in the water above their knees. "Hurry," said Ben. "I am hurrying," said Anne. With their last bit of breath, they climbed the steep hill of sand. Behind it lay the solid, high shore and the cottage. From the top of the hill, they looked down on the magic kingdom. The tide was pouring in on the farms and the green meadows. It had risen high in the forest. Tops of trees were disappearing beneath it. Towns and cities were sinking under the flood of blue water. The tide rose higher and higher. It covered the farms and the forests, the towns and the cities. Waves broke over the castles. Soon, only the tops of the castle towers remained glinting in the sun. "I wonder if there was time," said Anne. "Time for what?" said Ben. "For a happy ending," said Anne. "The tide came in too soon," said Ben. The last castle tower had vanished. They gazed out across the unbroken sea. Suddenly, Anne stood up. "The story didn't have any ending at all," she said. "When we left, it just stopped." She turned to Ben. "The king is still there in the story," she said, hoping to get to his throne. But Ben had his ear to the shell, and he was listening to the sea. The end.